gospel which has been sent throughout the whole world, and for the work of this kingdom that is filling the whole earth as the leaven fills the lump. Lord, we thank you that you've planted the mustard seed which is growing into a full tree. We pray that you would continue to prosper that. Bless us in our reflections over your work, the work of your church in Southeast Asia, and may it edify, strengthen us in our prayers, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. So, this afternoon, we'll have a little bit of a different format than our normal catechism class. This will amount to something of a report on the trip to Southeast Asia, and I envision that this will actually extend over at least 2 weeks. So not that we'll cover everything today, and I don't have anything formally prepared. Rather, I'm going to give you some highlights and then give you opportunity to ask questions, because it's hard for me to get inside your own heads and anticipate what it is that you might have most interest in. Let me begin by, first of all, saying thank you again, a hearty thanksgiving for all of your love and prayers for the people, the souls in Southeast Asia. This has been your labor, your work as a congregation and seeking the advance of the kingdom abroad, and I'm grateful for all that you've done to that end. So, kind of an overview of what took place. I left here on a Wednesday morning and did not arrive in Vavonia, Sri Lanka, until late Friday night. So, if you think of Singapore, Sri Lanka is a little off, but Singapore is literally the opposite side of the planet from us, right? So 12 hours difference. So when it's 4 o'clock here, it's 4 o'clock there, right? AM, PM. So it's the other side of the world, so it takes a long time to get there. And when you're traveling east, you're going against the sun, so you go Wednesday morning, don't get there till Friday night. Whereas coming home, you're traveling with the sun. And so I left at 2 a.m., well, Singapore anyway, I left 2 a.m. on Thursday and actually got here still on Thursday, right? Thursday night. So it's amazing difference. Anyway, so we get to Vavonia late Friday night. I preached in Vavonia a few times, and we made 2 trips to Molativo. You'll have to remember in your own head, the Vavonia is kind of north-central Sri Lanka, and then Molativo's out on the northeast coast, right? So they're about an hour and a half apart. So I was out to Molativo twice to preach and teach. And these are people, and the people in the congregation of Vavonia, these are people I've known, right? This is my 3rd trip to Sri Lanka, so some of these folk I've gotten to know quite well over the years, even little ones that are, growing up into their teens and young adulthood and so on. So that's special. The biggest event that took place was the opening of the church. So, Pastor Parthipan, Reverend Parthipan, has been absolutely exhausted. He's basically been trying to do full-time ministry with all of the various things they have going, the preschool program and the training of the ministers and the preaching and teaching and going back and forth to Molativo and all the other things that are taking place. And he's basically served as general contractor for the building project. So literally, from morning to night, he has to be not far away because he was directing the entire thing. So there was no one else that took that spot. Now, it's the 3rd world, so things are a little very different than what you're used to here in terms of how things work. So he's pretty exhausted. So I think it was a tremendous boon to him, personal encouragement for me to come, because he was pretty worn down at that point. I delivered our gifts, so that included a computer that had been purchased for him and a new cell phone and then a pile of money, and it blessed his socks off. I mean, he was overwhelmed. I mean, he didn't anticipate, I think, the degree to which we were able to bless him. In fact, I had told him a few months ago, well, we won't be able to send much and so on, and his expectations were low, so he was very overwhelmed. And for your information, the money that we sent, both the money gathered here and the money gathered from the other places in the presbytery that were combined, was sufficient for them to buy a piece of land in Molativo for a manse. So what happened is they decided to take the money that we sent and use that money to purchase a piece of property that they had been thinking about looking at to eventually build a manse for Molitivo, so that the person who's called to labor there will be able to have a place to live, and that'll keep costs down as well, make it a little more sustainable. So that was encouraging. I think they were all overwhelmed and blessed. The opening of the church went exceedingly well. Way more people there than was anticipated. People came from near and far. The building itself, I had envisioned, for some reason, I had envisioned in my head that they were doing a temporary shelter. So if you're following the stuff in the magazine, there's supposed to be some temporary shelter, and you'll remember they had to move out of the premises of where they'd been renting for the last many years because the property was being sold. They had already purchased this piece of property, a few years ago. And so they thought, well, we'll build a temporary shelter. Well, in the end, they were able to raise the money from Scotland and elsewhere to actually build the permanent building. I didn't know that. Somehow my signals were crossed. So I'm like driving up on a motorcycle to the building, and I'm looking at it from a distance, and I'm thinking to myself, what in the world? I mean, this is not what I, like that. If that's a temporary shelter, then what do we got in America, And so I get up there, and it's he's like, no, it's just like we ended up building the real thing. This is the full-blown thing. And so I was pretty shocked. So there's a wall that goes around the whole property. I mean, it's like a garden. They planted bushes and trees. The amount of work that was being done was enormous. I get there, show up Saturday morning, having arrived late that night, Friday night, and the amount of work they did in that single day, because the opening was on Monday, it's staggering. They put in a whole parking lot, and they did I can't even tell you. They put all the ceilings, and there was truckloads of stuff in a single day, so they were hustling. But so it's very spacious and well-designed and will serve the purposes. It includes places for people to live, 3 bathrooms, 4 bathrooms with showers. It's got the auditorium is sufficient, and they got a huge kitchen because they do a lot of feeding people, and there's all sorts of other stuff. So it's pretty encouraging, very impressive. I think everybody who saw it was pretty impressed, so that was good. So on the Sabbath, I preached both in Vavonia and in Molitivo, had the opening on Monday, with people that came for that. I'm trying to think of some story. Oh, there's one funny story. So at the after the opening, I preached at the opening on Monday. We have fellowship after. There's food, so you'll get a kick out of this. This is for the children. I was sitting behind a young mother with a baby that was probably 3 months old, a Tamil baby. Now you have to remember, the entire time that I was in Sri Lanka, I never saw a white person, right? Never saw a white person the whole time I was there. So I'm sitting behind this young mother, and this adorable little baby girl, big pudgy cheeks, just absolutely adorable. She turns around and looks at me and screamed bloody murder. Absolutely terror-stricken. She was terrified. I mean, the look of horror in her life. And I laughed, and the mother's embarrassed, and I'm like, oh, it's okay, you can scrub this off, there's black underneath, She thinks that I fell in a bucket of paint or she's seen a ghost or something. She's never seen a white person before. She's absolutely terrified. It was as scary as all get out. So, and then she turned around, she's fine, her mother's good. So every time she turned around and looked at me, she'd scream again. I'm trying to warm up to her, but she was terrified. It was funny. Anyway, let's see. So in Vavonia, let's see, what else took place? We have Pradiban, who's a mission worker in Molitivo, he and his family, and so he's carrying on a lot of the work, kind of as a student of the ministry in Molitivo. So I was able to spend time with him when I was there preaching twice as well. I know his kids pretty well and so on, but that's encouraging, that's moving forward. The future for Molitivo is in a young man that I've known for 6 years, that was, his family was one of the first families that ever came to the congregation in Vavonia. And he's now grown up and he's in his early 20s, and so he feels called to the ministry. So I have all these additional meetings, right? So I could list those off, but they'll, that won't be that interesting to you. One of them was on behalf of Scotland to interview him as a student in the ministry. So it was like the preliminary interview on behalf of the session, that the session will have to supplement, which will then go to the training the ministry committee. Young guy, very gifted, very godly, very exercised fella. But Lord willing, what will happen is he'll actually hopefully go to Scotland for 4 years or so, study like Parthi did, come back, and then he'll be able to help plant the church in Mullaitivo. So this is a native Tamil Sri Lankan who for the latter part of his upbringing, the last however many years, from his adolescence forward, grew up in the Free Church, right? So he's like a native Tamil Sri Lankan who grew up in the Free Church and now he's going to be, Lord willing, his interview went very well as far as I was concerned. And so that's very encouraging. So he, there's good hopes, good prospects that he'll be going to Mullaitivo eventually. You know what? I'm going to stop and let you ask questions because I could give you smatterings of various details, but maybe it would help to know what you want to hear most. What do you want to hear about Sri Lanka, right? So my first week was spent Friday to Friday in Sri Lanka. What do you want to hear about that? So the military unrest, remember there's bombings and stuff? If you don't ask questions, I'm going to keep talking. So when we would go from Pavonia to Mullaitivo, there were military checkpoints. Now, it's infuriating. Americans would never put up with it. Well, I hope they would never put up with this. Literally, you have roadblocks. You're driving on these like third world roads, dirt roads, military checkpoint, blockade. They come, get your stuff, ask for your papers, come to me, try to ask for my passport, want to search the car, whatever. Parthi's got to go fill out stuff and all this business. The thing that's irritating is the bombs went off in the south. I don't know if you remember. The Sinhalese people, which are Buddhist and they speak Sinhalese, they own the government, right? They're in the south. And the Tamils are the minority in the north, and that's Parthi and his people. And they speak Tamil. And remember, there was 30 years civil war, and I told you about the Tamil Tigers and LTT and all that. Well, the bombs go off in the south. The government uses every excuse to pretty much stick the Tamil's face in it, So here we are way up north, way, way, way away from where the bombings took place, and all the military checkpoints are up there. None of them down by Colombo, where you fly in the capital. And they're Sinhalese people, so the Tamils don't even speak their language. So it becomes very awkward. And at one point, I think it was the second trip, third roadblock, sometimes all these trucks are going through. Parthi says because they know they're driven by Sinhalese people. And so they could be full of truckloads of bombs. And then they stop the people that they know are the Tamils and harass them. So I eventually had it, right? So I'm fussed at the soldier and I'm fussed at the whole thing. And I went over to the tent thing and I'm giving them grief. And they don't speak a word of English. So they don't have a clue what I'm saying. But they know the white guy's upset. And Parthi calls somebody. He calls a colonel that he knows somehow. And the colonel then tells Parthi, you tell me, and then I'll call, and then make sure that your license plate at all the checkpoints, they just let you straight through. Well, it gives you a little insight into the corruption, right? It's who you know. And so, anyway, in terms of unrest, there's really nothing going on in terms of violence or anything. But the military are using it as an opportunity to kind of hammer the Tamils, which makes Parthi upset. All right, I'll stop. Questions about Sri Lanka? Mm-hmm.
Do you know if there's much potential for local ruling elders?
It's a good question. They desperately need local ruling elders. And at present, there really isn't. It's sincerely, there isn't. I mean, I look at the situation myself. There's some older, some older men. They've had so many problems. I mean, you realize when you're planting a work in a pagan country with no background, it's messy. So they've had all sorts of discipline issues, and there's people that I would have thought of 6 years ago might be good, and there's been all sorts of problems that have happened, and now it's impossible. And I think the prospects are mostly this young crowd that's coming up. So in Vavonia, you've got a whole bunch of young men, like teens, 20s, bunches of them, that are like serious, on fire for the Lord, have like been in the church for years, really, walking with the Lord. That's where the most potential is, I think, in terms of coming up through the ranks. So there's future prospects, but probably not at present so much. Yeah. Other questions about Sri Lanka? Okay, nada. On Friday, I flew to Singapore. And then, just overview now. Week in Sri Lanka. Friday, I fly to Singapore. And then I preached in Singapore both ends of the day on Sabbath. Then we drove from Singapore on Monday across the border into southern Malaysia, Johor Bahru, where the conference was being held. And so then I preached at the conference all week long. And that's a gathering of people, not just from Singapore, but from Thailand and Cambodia and the Philippines and, China and various other places throughout, Asia. So then I preached all week there. And it was mostly to this conference, but then they had another church, two churches were having a conference at the same time, and they actually combined them. So one evening I preached to the combined number, which was probably 400 or more people. And I can tell you about that. But at the end of that week, then on Friday, drove back to Singapore, Sabbath preached in Singapore twice again. And then Monday, I flew to Penang, Malaysia, which is up in northeast Malaysia, and I preached there for 2 days, Monday and Tuesday. And then Wednesday night, I flew back to Singapore, and then from Singapore back home. So that's kind of the overview. In between all I think I preached like 20 times or more while I was gone. So it was just like boom, 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 boom. In between, this was by far the busiest trip I've ever had. I've never had one quite like this because there were so many meetings. So, you had like when I was in Singapore, the church there, the session asked to meet with me for a couple times for a few hours to pick my brain and get counseling on stuff that they're dealing with. Then I had like interview this minister from the Philippines, as an outside person. And then, it's all over, and at 10 o'clock at night, there's someone from Cambodia who's a student from the ministry who wants to meet and ask counsel. It was like that, like filled, So for example, after the conference, we go back to Singapore Friday night. I have a meeting with the session that night, and then all Saturday from breakfast until 9 p.m., I had one meeting after another, So it was full. Okay, so now back to Singapore. So Friday I went to Singapore and then preached there twice. Questions about PCC? So they have 3 pastors. I've told you some of this before. Pastor Lim, Linus, and Housing. They're a congregation of probably 180 people. Asian faces, just like GPC, King James, Scottish Psalter, English speaking. Worship's pretty much identical to ourselves. So I've told you something about the background there, but what particular questions do you have about Singapore before we go to the conference? Hannah. Yeah, good question. So in Sri Lanka, someone always had to translate. So in Sri Lanka, nobody speaks English other than Parthi. And his cousin, Ranjan. So Ranjan is actually a part of PC. Ranjan is a native Tamil Sri Lankan, and he has like his PhD in chemical engineering. He ended up moving to Singapore, and he's lived there for years now. And so he's actually a member of the church at PCC, right? The church that I'm preaching at. He's a member there and lives in Singapore. But so he came back to Sri Lanka while I was there, and he actually did the translating. But like when I'm talking to people personally, even one-on-one, it has to be through a translator. Whereas in Sri Lanka, no translator, right? They're all English speaking. And at the conference, no translator. And in Penang, no translator was necessary. All right, other questions about Singapore? Let's see. What can I tell the kids that would be interesting? Well, let me say, first of all, I'm very, 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 very encouraged by the work at PCC. I mean, what a phenomenal congregation. Godly elders, deacons, they have far-reaching ministries. So they have missions to the Karen people in Thailand, to this work in southern Philippines, to Malawi. I mean, that congregation is doing tremendous amount obviously Malawi's in Africa, but mostly in Southeast Asia. So there's some really, really, really encouraging things going on. Some very godly people, and it's a real blessing to be with them. Very loving folk, appreciative folk. So it's a delight to be with them in many ways. But what would be interesting? Oh, I know one thing that'd be interesting for the children. So, the strangest thing I ate while I was in Singapore, right? This will intrigue the children. On the last Sabbath I was there, they brought me a little jar, it had a lid on it, and they said, "We want you to drink this as a Chinese tonic." I said, "No problem." They popped the lid, and I said, "What is it?" And they said, "It's bird's nest." I said, "Okay, what?" I figured it was a nickname. What's in it? And they said, "Bird's nest." And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" They're like, "No, we're serious." They climb up the tree, they take the bird's nest, they bring it down, they cook it. And so I look at it, and it's kind of clear with kind of milky, almost like egg white in it, or I don't know. I was like, "Is there eggs in it?" And they're like, "No, there's no eggs in it. It's just a bird nest." Really good for you. Super expensive. Really good for you. I said, "Okay." So, and it has it's like rock sugar or something in it. So yeah, I swigged it. It was fine. I mean, it's a little sweet from the sugar. Didn't taste like much. And I said, "Super good for you." And then I said, "Well, bird's nest, I usually think of branches and leaves and that sort of stuff. I can't see any of that in here, Surely all the cooking doesn't take away some semblance of leaves." And they said, "Oh," they were waiting. They said the bird's nest is actually made of bird spit. So it's true, bird saliva. So it's like bird saliva that it's actually made of. And so they take this thing down and they cook it, and then they drink it, and I told them my kids at home will love this. The little people at home will think this is fantastic. So that was pretty interesting. All right, questions about? I guess I'll wait till next week to talk about the conference because that's a big deal.
So does Arthi minister at different sites?
Yeah, the main church is in Vavonia. Yeah, and then Molativo is the one out on the coast, and he goes to both.
How far?
Hour and a half, except for when they're stopping you at every single military checkpoint, and then it takes like 2.5.
More today.
Yeah.
How does the break up the day to be in 2 locations?
It depends. So he does have Pradiban, who can preach as a student in Molativo. And he has this student whom I interviewed in Vavonia as well, right? So he can use them some. But some weeks it'll be he's just preaching both ends of Vavonia. Some weeks he's preaching one end, preaching in Vavonia, then Molativo and back in Vavonia. And then Pradiban would preach in the evening in Molativo. And then the prayer meetings are on different days. So he can be in both places, during the week.
Would Sri Lanka be similar in size to, I'm thinking of Northern Ireland compared to Ireland. Would the Tamil region be something analogous to Ulster or Northern Ireland?
Yeah. Be analogous, not in size or shape, but concept, for sure. 2 totally different people. Tamil people are actually, Parthi would say they were there first, and they're way smarter. And so the Sinhalese have to keep them oppressed because otherwise the Tamils would take over the place and all sorts of, and I believe him. I mean, I think he's probably right.
You say it's not the same size, it's smaller?
Well, it's shaped like a teardrop. So as you go to the north, it tapers, right? I don't know. I haven't, an overlay. I would be bigger than Northern Ireland, by way bigger. But, Mr. Urban. No. He doesn't do street preaching. Yeah, 330 million gods. Yeah. Yeah.
And I wondered how we go about, saying, away with all of these.
Right.
Sort of invisible God. I just wondered if you had interface with that.
Yeah, tons of interface. I mean, most of the people, I mean, they, like when I was there were Hindu people in the pew, right? So people who were unconverted Hindus in the pew, and that's normal for him. So they do the outreach to these children, schooling and all of that stuff, and then the connections to the home. He gets in the homes, and they end up coming to church and so on. And it's pretty, in their society that actually works very well. People do come, and they've had Hindu people that are converted. It's pretty, like with any, I mean, their religion is obviously all encompassing in terms of their life, family connections, and all the stuff that goes with it. So it's a pretty radical severance when they turn away from that. But the problem is you can get some Hindus who are like, well, that's no problem. I mean, Jesus is God. Sweet. No problem with that. We got 330 million of them. You know what I mean? So to say he is, that the God of the Bible is the only God, and then all of this other stuff is garbage. And they're very superstitious. So there's huge Hindu temples everywhere, little tiny shrines everywhere. And they stop and burn a little incense, put paint on their head, and put paint on their car, and whatever else to keep themselves safe in a driving, on a short trip or whatever. And yeah, somebody else raised their hand.
What do they do for work, commerce, industry?
Yeah, let's see, it's not so much, there's not so much farming probably. There's some subsistence stuff. What do they do? I mean, there's a mix of laborers and, you have people who do concrete and do, electrical and do garbage and, shops and restaurants and, street food type restaurants and that sort of thing. They have, I suppose, and I haven't been to the part of Tamil that's the tea country, but that would be a huge industry, right? Gigantic industry. And that would be farming. I mean, it's summer all the time, all year round, right? It's hot and humid all year round. So there's food. They may be poor as dirt, but they'll never starve. Because everybody's got papaya and coconut and jackfruit and durian and, bananas and all this stuff growing in their yard everywhere. And they got fresh fish and fresh whatever, meat and so on and so forth. But commercialized farming's not probably as big as it would be here, other than tea. Sarah?
Two questions. First of all, you may have actually said this many times and I just missed it, but I'm wondering what size the congregations are.
Yeah, that's good. So Malativa would be probably in the 20s, and Vavonia depends. So it could be in the 40s in the morning, but it could be like 70s or 80 in the evening, because they get more people in the evening that come.
And then for the children, culturally, would a child, be very similar to here as far as their day with getting up, going to school, that kind of thing? Or is there a huge cultural difference in something that they would do through the day that's different than over here?
Yeah, that's a good question. Generally speaking, it would be the same. So they get up, they go to school, and come home. Yeah. Generally speaking. I mean, you can, there's kids that drop out of school, don't go to school at all, right? It's not compulsory. But if they want to be able to make do, they need to go to school. I don't think there's any homeschoolers, And there's no Christian schools to speak of. So most of the Christians would go to there's different types of schools, so they can go to, if they have a little extra, they can go to more of like a private foreign school sort of thing. They're really big into, what happens is most of them just go to the normal school, and then tutoring is the big deal. Because the normal school is garbage. Like the teachers don't have a clue. I mean, they're like terrible. They don't even know the material they're trying to teach. So you learn very little. Education is terrible. And so it's the extras after school where you pay for tutoring or where you actually get smart and learn stuff and so on. So the poor, super poor, don't get that. They just get whatever paltry stuff is at the school. And the people who have a little more, who may still be very poor but have a little more, will work hard to get their kids this extra so that there's a shot of having a better education. Yeah. Christopher. Good question. I'm thinking they were earlier. I think it was like, I think the first service was at 9:30 and the second was like 4:30 or something. The afternoon or evening service. Yeah. Chris. Good question. Now I have to remember. It's a long time ago. Yeah, what did I preach on? Well, I know at the opening I preached from Colossians 1 on Christ's headship and that. What did I preach in Sri Lanka, man? I don't even know if I can remember. I could remember the conference better and PCC better. I preached in... Is being sick an excuse? I don't know. What did I preach? I preached on, let me think here. Sri Lanka, it seems like about 2 years ago. So the first Sabbath I was at Maldiva and Vivonia. I could look it up and tell you. Sorry, it's terrible.
Did you preach anything that you have preached here?
Yeah. Yeah.
Were there ever any instances in Sri Lanka where you were out in public because you're the only white guy you felt comfortable or
Never.
safe?
Yeah, never. Good question, though. Other questions? Yep, Jenny? Yeah, yeah. 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 And the beard as well. That adds to the aura for them. I mean, they have beards too, some of them. But I was eating at someone's house, it was actually an unconverted family's house. I mean, I say at their house, like outside in the yard, eating. And someone showed up, some family member, and said to me, "Assalamu alaikum," and laughed, which is Arabic, right? They thought like I was a Muslim or something because of the beard, which wasn't typical. I mean, that's not what most of them thought, but anyway. What was your question again? I don't remember your question. Yeah.
Just did people look at you funny, like, were you
Yeah.
stand out?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, Grace.
Where did you stay at? Whose house were you
Yeah, so I stayed at Parthis. Yep. Stayed at Parthis in Sri Lanka. And then, so I always stay there. Obviously, he's the only one that speaks English. Sri Lanka is more difficult than Singapore. I mean, Sri Lanka is third world, and there's no relief from the heat and humidity. So it's pretty much, at night, you're sleeping on top of the bed and you're soaked sweat. So you get heat rash, and actually this time, my hands and feet swelled up big time. Like I looked up, my ankles looked obese from the heat, contrast or whatever. But then when you go to Singapore, it's the same, right? It's on the equator, and there's all the heat and humidity, but there's some relief because they have, not all the houses have AC, but they'll have it at night at least, and there's in some of the buildings and in the cars and stuff, there's AC, so that makes it a lot easier. Way easier. Way more comfortable. In Singapore, I actually stayed with a Dutch family who've been going to PCC for the last year because he was stationed there, and they're returning home next month in July. And then at the conference, I stayed at where the conference is held, like everybody else. And in Penang, I stayed at a hotel. Yeah. Other questions? Oops, sorry, Mrs. Fithy.
kids taught English?
In Sri Lanka?
Yeah, well, in any place.
Well, I mean, Singapore, they all speak English. Everybody speaks English. Yeah, everybody speaks English in Singapore. In Sri Lanka, some of the kids are learning English, yeah. So, yeah, there's some who are learning English in school. Most of them would be, it's pretty rudimentary. So Pradeepan's kids, I've known since they were, since the first time I went in 2013. And their English is you can have a conversation with them. It'd be limited, but you could have a conversation with them for sure.
No.
Did you have to watch? Did you drink enough water when you did?
Yeah, drink enough water. You can't drink the water in Sri Lanka, right? So like even in the shower, you have to make sure you keep your mouth tightly closed. But but you drink clean water. Yep. Tamil is pretty, in Sri Lanka, I love language. I love languages. But the Tamil is pretty hard. There are 247 letters. No joke. 247 letters. I think it's the most of any in the world. And their grammar is mega hard. So you can't, it's hard to play with Tamil. You either have to say, I'm going to buckle down and be hardcore or not. It's very hard language, super hard language. All the different sounds. They'll say 5 different letters. Le, 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 le. But each le is slightly different. And you almost have to have your ear tuned from the time you're little to distinguish the difference, And so those will be 5 different sounds. So it's pretty, so I would learn little things like, thank you and, little greetings and stuff. Hannah? No. Hopefully not soon. Other questions? Joseph?
Do you have any accounts or particular events that stand out as it pertains to the piety of the people there?
Yeah. In Sri Lanka? Sri Lanka, it's more rudimentary. So the people are new to Christianity, some of them. Some of them have come out of charismatic churches and have become reformed. And so there are some who've embraced it fully and are sincere Christians, but they're pretty young in terms of maturity. Whereas in Singapore, you have very godly, mature Christians. Very theologically astute, spiritually exercised, and be different.
What is there in a way in Sri Lanka of reformed literature? Is there a library in church?
Yeah, there's been some, they've been working on getting the Psalter. They don't even have a whole Psalter, metrical Psalter yet. They obviously sing unaccompanied psalms, but they don't have the psalms completed yet even. But there have been things like the Westminster Standards, and there are basic bits of literature and some even contemporary reform books that have been translated into Tamil. Not a lot, but there are some. Yeah. Jenny. It's okay.
Was singing the Psalms,
Yeah.
they use our Psalter in that Parthenon church, right?
No, Parthipan is Tamil only, right? So they have an incomplete Tamil metrical Psalter. Some of their tunes are common meter, so I can sing our Psalter to their tunes while they're singing in Tamil. Some of them aren't common meter, but yeah, some of them are familiar tunes. Most of them are familiar tunes. In Singapore, they use our Psalter. Yeah, it's it's no different. Yeah. Yeah, I actually they talked to me about this. It's definitely faster. So I would rate them at I told them, there are groups I can mention that are on the super slow side, right? They're in one bucket. Then there's y'all and RPs who are lightning fast on the other side, and we're the perfect balance in the middle. They laughed. They thought that was good. Yeah, they sing. But it's the Scottish Psalter. It's the same as us. Yeah, seamless. If you showed up on a Sabbath in Singapore and closed your eyes and didn't see all the Asian people, you would think you were home.
Singapore, do they have trees in their yards too? Do they go to the supermarket?
Yeah, no. So, I mean, Singapore is designed as kind of a garden city, so there's lots of green. It's not just concrete and steel. But in terms of Singapore, it's interesting. Singapore has almost nothing in terms of natural resources. They have brains. They have people. They're super smart. And so they're first class, first world, really successful country. But it's just the whole country's almost a city, right? Whereas Sri Lanka, phenomenal natural resources, gems, gold, silver, tea, coffee, fruits and vegetables, the fish in the sea, tons and tons and tons. And they have a very corrupt government with all sorts of instability. And so they're floundering, right? Third world. So Singapore imports everything. Singapore, I laughed. Singapore gets water from Malaysia. Malaysia is right there, right? Malaysia is a kind of a third world country too, but it's Muslim. Singapore's smart. They get the water from Malaysia, and then they sell it back to the Malaysians. They sell them their own water. It's hilarious. All right. What else? Anything? All right, this has been good. We'll pick it up again next week. I'm excited to tell you about the conference because that was a real highlight, and that'll give us something to talk about next week. Thank you.